world where a woman's worth is measured by the husband at her side and the children at her feet, 40-year-old Magdalene endures daily mockery with quiet dignity. Who would buy bread from rejected hands? They jeer, as if her unmarried status has somehow tainted even the loaves she bakes with such care. But when a mysterious hooded stranger appears in the village marketplace, everything changes. Unlike the cruel villagers, he sees beyond her age, beyond society's cruel judgment. He sees her soul. With each encounter, a connection grows between them that defies explanation, a bond that makes the entire village whisper with suspicion and envy. What Magdalene doesn't know is that this humble traveler carries a secret that will shock the kingdom to its core and force her to make an impossible choice. A secret that will turn her from the village's favorite target of ridicule into the most talked-about woman in the entire realm. But is she ready for what happens when the hood finally comes off? The morning sun cast long shadows across the village square as Magdalene made her way through the crowded marketplace. Her weathered hands clutched a basket of freshly baked bread, the fruits of her labor since before dawn. The aroma of the warm loaves should have brought customers flocking to her, but instead, it was the cruel whispers that followed her every step. There she goes again, the spinster of Oakenfield. A young woman in a vibrant blue dress sneered, loud enough for all to hear. 40 years old and not even a husband to warm her bed. What man would want such a withered apple when there are so many fresh ones to pick? Laughter erupted around her like a sudden thunderstorm. Magdalene's cheeks burned not from the heat of her oven, but from the shame that had become her constant companion. Yet she kept her chin raised, a quiet dignity in her posture that spoke of a strength her tormentors could never understand. Who would buy bread from rejected hands? Another voice called out. Perhaps her loaves are as stale as her hopes for marriage. More laughter, more pain. Magdalene clutched her basket tighter, her knuckles turning white. She had endured this mockery for years now, ever since the gray had begun to streak her once auburn hair. In a world where a woman's value was measured by the children at her skirts and the husband at her side, she had become nothing more than a cautionary tale. I hear she turned down the blacksmith's son when she was 20. An elderly woman whispered to her companion. Now look at her. Pride comes before the fall, they say. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Magdalene had nursed her dying mother through 15 years of wasting illness, sacrificing her youth to ensure the woman who gave her life could leave this world with dignity. By the time her mother had finally passed, Magdalene's bloom had faded in the eyes of potential suitors. Not that she would ever explain this to her tormentors. Some pains were too sacred to be used as shields against cruelty. My bread is fresh, she announced, her voice steady despite the trembling in her heart. Baked this morning with the finest flour from Miller Thompson's mill. A few regular customers approached, mostly elderly folk who valued quality over gossip. As Magdalene handed over a loaf to old Widow Hawthorne, something shifted in the atmosphere of the marketplace. A ripple of tension spread through the crowd, subtle but unmistakable, like the first breath of wind before a storm. Between the sea of familiar faces, a stranger stood watching. Tall and still amid the bustling throng, he wore simple traveling clothes and a hood that partially obscured his features. But what caught Magdalene's attention were his eyes, deep, observant, and fixed upon her with an intensity that made her breath catch. It wasn't pity in his gaze. She had grown accustomed to recognizing that particular emotion and had come to despise it more than the mockery. No, what shone in this stranger's eyes was something far more unsettling: fascination. While others laughed and pointed, this man studied her as one might examine a rare manuscript, with reverence and curiosity. His stillness amid the chaos was disorienting, like finding a stone unmoved by rushing water. "Perhaps she's a witch," shouted a boy who couldn't have been more than 12, emboldened by the cruelty of his elders. "That's why she needs no husband. She has demons for company." The crowd roared with laughter, but the stranger's expression darkened. For a moment, something flashed across his face. Anger, perhaps, though it was gone so quickly Magdalene couldn't be certain she hadn't imagined it. The man took a step forward, then seemed to reconsider. His hand, which had begun to rise as if to silence the crowd, fell back to his side. Instead, he pulled his hood lower and continued watching from the shadows. Magdalene turned away, focusing on arranging her loaves. She had learned long ago that acknowledging the taunts only encouraged them. Still, she couldn't help but wonder about the mysterious observer. Travelers were common enough in their village, situated as it was on the road to the capital, but something about this particular man seemed different. There was a quiet authority in his bearing that contradicted his humble attire. As the morning wore on, the mockery gradually subsided, replaced by the usual business of market day. Magdalene sold most of her bread, though several villagers made a show of avoiding her stall. When only 3 loaves remained, she began packing up, ready to return to the solitude of her small cottage at the edge of the woods. It was then that the stranger approached. "Your bread," he said simply, his voice deep and cultured. "Is there any left to purchase?" Up close, Magdalene could see that though his clothes were plain, they were of fine quality. His hands bore no calluses of farm work, and his posture spoke of someone unaccustomed to bowing. "Yes," she replied, surprised by the formality of his speech. 3 loaves remain." "I'll take one," he said, reaching for a small pouch tied at his waist. As their hands briefly touched during the exchange, Magdalene felt a strange sensation, like standing too close to lightning. The stranger's eyes met hers, and for a moment, the noise of the marketplace faded away. She had the disconcerting feeling that he was seeing something in her that others had missed, something that even she had forgotten existed. "They don't see you," he murmured, so quietly she almost missed it. Before she could respond, he turned and disappeared into the crowd, his hooded figure soon lost among the throng. Magdalene stood frozen, the coins he had given her clutched tightly in her palm. Only when she opened her hand did she realize they were not the copper pieces used for daily trade, but silver, far more than a simple loaf was worth. What Magdalene couldn't know was that the hooded man wasn't who he appeared to be. The poor traveler, with his steady gaze and mysterious words, carried a secret that would soon turn her world upside down. And on that morning of mockery and shame, the wheel of fate had begun to turn, faster than she could possibly bear. Little did she realize that the stranger's eyes followed her all the way home, watching with an interest that went far beyond curiosity. The question that would soon shake the foundations of her existence remained unasked in the autumn air. Who was the hooded man who had looked at her not with derision, but with something that almost resembled recognition? The next day dawned with a chill that spoke of winter's approach. Magdalene's fingers were stiff as she arranged the fresh loaves on her wooden table. The marketplace slowly came to life around her, merchants setting up their stalls with practiced efficiency, the blacksmith's hammer creating a steady rhythm that echoed through the square. She had risen before the sun, determined to bake her finest bread yet, though she refused to acknowledge the quiet hope that the mysterious stranger might return. She had examined the silver coins a dozen times by candlelight, turning them over and over in her calloused hands. They were not just any silver pieces, but bore the intricate royal seal, the kind that rarely circulated among common folk. The question had haunted her through the night. Who would carry such currency and yet dress as a simple traveler? The usual taunts began as the village women gathered by the well. "Look, she's wearing her best apron today," one of them remarked with exaggerated surprise. "Perhaps she thinks she can still catch a husband with fresh linen and stale charms." Magdalene pretended not to hear, focusing instead on arranging her bread just so, each loaf positioned to show its perfect crust. The mockery stung less today, somehow. The encounter with the stranger had left her with an odd sense of validation, as if his attention had restored something that years of ridicule had worn away. The morning passed slowly. Customers came and went, some avoiding her gaze, others buying her bread with stiff politeness. It was approaching midday when a hush fell over her corner of the marketplace, the same peculiar silence that had preceded the stranger's appearance yesterday. And there he was, standing before her stall, tall and straight-backed, his face still partially hidden by that same hood. Yet today, something about him seemed different, more purposeful, as if he had made a decision during the night that now guided his actions. "Good day," he said, his voice cutting through the sudden quiet. The village women nearby fell silent, eyeing the stranger with undisguised curiosity. A man paying attention to the spinster was unusual enough to warrant their interest. "Good day to you, sir," Magdalene replied, surprised at the steadiness in her voice despite the rapid beating of her heart. "I would like one loaf," he said simply, as she reached for her finest creation, a perfectly formed country loaf with a dusting of flour still visible on its crust. Their eyes met. His gaze held hers with such calm intensity that the bustle of the marketplace seemed to fade into a distant murmur. There was something in those eyes, something that made Magdalene feel as if he could see past the labels the village had placed upon her, past the years of quiet resignation, into some essential part of herself that she had nearly forgotten existed. When he spoke again, his voice was deeper, almost intimate, though he said nothing beyond ordinary pleasantries. "Your bread yesterday was exceptional. I have not tasted its equal in the capital." The capital. So he had traveled from the king's city. Magdalene nodded her thanks, but as she handed him the bread, a strange tension crept into the exchange. He reached into his pouch to pay, and this time, without the shock of their first meeting to distract her, Magdalene clearly saw the coin he offered. It was gold. Not just any gold coin, but one bearing the distinctive mark used exclusively in royal banquets. An intricate pattern of crossed swords beneath a crown that no ordinary traveler would possess. Magdalene's hands trembled slightly as she accepted it, her mind racing. This was no wandering merchant or common traveler. No one but the highest nobility would carry such currency so casually. This is too much," she whispered, unable to look away from the gleaming metal in her palm. "Is it?" he asked, and there was something like amusement in his voice. "Perhaps the value of honest bread made by honest hands is greater than you know." A murmur swept through the onlookers who had edged closer, pretending to examine nearby wares while straining to overhear the exchange. Magdalene felt their eyes like physical pressure on her skin. "Who are you?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, barely audible even to her own ears. The stranger's lips curved into the barest hint of a smile. "Someone who recognizes worth when others miss it," he replied cryptically. His fingers brushed against hers as he took the bread, lingering for just a moment longer than necessary. "Someone who has grown weary of masks and pretense." With that, he turned to leave, but paused after a few steps and looked back at her. "I will return tomorrow, if I may. Your bread brings comfort I had not expected to find here." As he walked away, Magdalene became aware of the whispers erupting around her. The wealthy merchant Alderman Thomas, who had been eyeing the exchange with naked curiosity, approached her stall with unusual interest. "Strange company you keep these days, Magdalene," he said, his voice heavy with insinuation. "That man's coin seems suspiciously rich for his appearance, doesn't it? One might wonder what a person of such obvious means seeks in our humble village. And at your stall in particular." The micro-tension that had been building since the stranger's arrival suddenly crystallized. Magdalene saw the calculation in Thomas's eyes, the beginnings of suspicion and jealousy. As the village's most prominent merchant, he was used to being the center of attention, particularly from unmarried women seeking security. The stranger's interest in Magdalene, plain, aging Magdalene, clearly confounded and irritated him. "He simply appreciates good bread," she answered, trying to keep her voice neutral. Thomas laughed, a sharp sound without humor. "Does he now? And is it your bread he comes to taste, or something else entirely? A man who pays in royal coin doesn't travel alone to buy peasant fare unless he seeks other pleasures." Heat rushed to Magdalene's face. "You insult me, sir." "Do I? Or do I merely speak what others are already thinking?" He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "What sorcery have you worked to draw such a man to your table, when younger, prettier girls stand ignored? Perhaps there's more to our village spinster than meets the eye." As Thomas sauntered away, Magdalene felt the weight of fresh speculation settling upon her shoulders. The whispers had taken on a new, darker tone. No longer was she merely the object of mockery for her unmarried state. Now she was the focus of suspicious speculation. When she finally closed her stall that evening and walked the lonely path to her cottage, a strange emptiness filled her chest. The stranger had seen her, truly seen her, when others looked through her. For those brief moments, she had felt something she hadn't experienced in decades. the sensation of being valued. Yet his departure had left a void more painful than the familiar loneliness. What did it mean when a man with royal coins looked at a 40-year-old village baker as if she were worthy of notice? What game was he playing, and at what cost to her already precarious position in the village? That night, as she stared into the dying embers of her fire, Magdalene rolled the gold coin between her fingers, watching how it caught the light. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a different life, one where she wasn't defined by what she lacked, but by what she might still become. Little did she know that miles away, in the royal castle, the same man had removed his hood. As torchlight gleamed on his crown, the king contemplated the baker woman whose dignity had stirred something long dormant within him, something his court of flattery and falsehood had nearly extinguished. The castle loomed against the night sky, its stone towers reaching toward the stars like grasping fingers. Behind its imposing walls, where tapestries muffled whispers and secrets hid in shadowed corners, a single figure stood at the window of the royal chamber. The hood that had concealed his identity in the village marketplace now lay discarded on a velvet-covered chair. King Alaric IV, ruler of Westervale for 17 years, gazed out at the kingdom that stretched before him. His reflection in the glass revealed a man in his mid-40s, with a face that had grown accustomed to masking emotion. The stern countenance that struck fear into neighboring kingdoms and commanded absolute obedience from his court had softened now in the privacy of his chambers. His thoughts were not of state matters or diplomatic strategies, but of a woman with quiet dignity who sold bread in a humble village square. "Your Majesty," came a voice from the doorway. The king's most trusted advisor, Lord Cedric, entered with a bow. "The Duke of Easthold awaits your decision on the matter of taxes, and the ambassador from Northumbria has requested an audience for tomorrow morning." The king did not turn from the window. "They can wait." Lord Cedric approached cautiously, noting the unusual distraction in his sovereign's manner. For nearly 2 decades, King Alaric had been known for his cold efficiency, his ruthless attention to matters of state. Nothing diverted him from the business of ruling, not pleasure, not sentiment, certainly not the trivialities that occupied lesser men. Yet for the past 2 days, something had changed. "Sire," Cedric ventured, "the court has noticed your absences. There are questions." "Let them question," the king replied, his voice hardening slightly. "Am I not permitted to ride through my own kingdom without accounting for every hour?" Cedric hesitated. "Of course, Your Majesty. But there are matters requiring your attention. The Princess of Moravia's father has sent another letter regarding the proposed alliance. He grows impatient for your answer." At the mention of the princess, a political match that would strengthen Westervale's northern border, the king finally turned from the window. His expression had returned to the impassive mask his subjects knew so well. "Tell him I am considering the proposal with the gravity it deserves," he said dismissively. "And arrange for the royal tailor to attend me tomorrow. I require new garments, simple ones." "Simple, sire?" Cedric could not hide his surprise. King Alaric was known for his practical approach to royal attire, never ostentatious, but always of a quality befitting his station. "Yes, the kind a wealthy merchant might wear when traveling. Nothing that would draw undue attention." Understanding dawned in the advisor's eyes, followed swiftly by concern. "Your Majesty, these excursions to the village, they are unwise. If something were to happen—" "Nothing will happen," the king cut him off. "The royal guard follows at a distance. I am never truly unprotected." "It is not merely your physical safety that concerns me," Cedric pressed. "Your reputation is mine to risk," Alaric finished firmly. "You forget yourself, Lord Cedric." A tense silence filled the chamber. Cedric had served the king since his coronation and was one of the few who dared speak frankly to him. Even so, there were boundaries. "Forgive me, Your Majesty," he said with another bow. "I speak only out of loyalty." The king's expression softened slightly. "I know, and I value that loyalty. But in this matter, I require your discretion more than your counsel." Once alone again, King Alaric moved to his desk, where a small object caught the candlelight. He picked it up, turning it between his fingers. A simple silver coin, identical to the one he had given Magdalene during their first encounter. In the quiet of his chamber, a strange warmth spread through his chest as he remembered the dignity with which he had borne the villagers' cruelty. No courtier had ever shown such genuine strength of character. For 17 years he had ruled with an iron will, never allowing sentiment to cloud his judgment. Widowed young, he had devoted himself to building a kingdom that would stand for centuries. Potential queens had been presented to him as political advantages, never as companions. The courtiers who surrounded him daily wore masks as practiced as his own, flattery disguising ambition, loyalty offered only as long as it served their interests. Then, on what should have been a routine journey through his realm, he had stopped in that unremarkable village and witnessed something that had pierced through years of cynicism: authenticity. Magdalene's quiet resilience amid mockery had struck him like a physical blow. The contrast between her genuine dignity and the calculated performances of his court had awakened something he had long suppressed, a longing for truth. As he placed the coin back on the desk, the king noticed a subtle tension in the air, a sense that he stood at the edge of a precipice. What had begun as mere curiosity was rapidly becoming something far more dangerous. The coin he had given her at the marketplace was used only at royal banquets, bearing a distinct mark that anyone with knowledge of court currency would recognize instantly. If she showed it to the right person, if she spoke of the stranger's interest in her, the charade could collapse before it had properly begun. Yet despite the risk, or perhaps because of it, Alaric felt more alive than he had in years. The thought of returning to the village, of seeing recognition dawn in Magdalene's eyes when she finally understood who had been visiting her stall, sent a thrill through him that no state victory had matched. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. The captain of the royal guard entered, his expression grave. "Your Majesty, forgive the intrusion. There is talk among the servants. Your disguised journeys have not gone unnoticed." The king's jaw tightened. "Who speaks of this?" "No one directly, sire. But there are whispers, questions about your interest in the village of Oakenfield." "And what do these whispers suggest?" The captain shifted uncomfortably. "Some speculate that your Majesty has found entertainment there. A woman, perhaps." King Alaric turned away to hide the flash of anger in his eyes. The court's assumption that his interest must be carnal rather than genuine only reinforced his growing disillusionment. "Let them speculate," he said at last. "It keeps them occupied." "As you wish, sire. Will you be riding out again tomorrow?" There was a pause as the king considered the question, weighing risk against desire. "Yes," he said finally. "Have my plain clothes ready at dawn. And ensure the guards remain at a distance. I will not have my presence announced by an escort of armed men." After the captain had departed, King Alaric returned to the window. In the vast darkness beyond the castle, somewhere among the scattered lights of distant villages, was the small cottage where Magdalene now slept. Did she dream of the stranger who had looked at her with such interest? Did she wonder about his true identity? Tomorrow he would see her again. Tomorrow he would hear her speak without the guarded formality his title usually inspired in others. For a few precious hours he would be valued not for his crown, but for himself, a luxury no king had ever truly known. As he finally retired to his bed, Alaric's thoughts were not of the princess whose hand would strengthen his kingdom, nor of the diplomatic challenges awaiting him. Instead, he recalled the simple courage of a village woman who had endured years of mockery, yet maintained her dignity. In the quiet darkness, he admitted to himself what he dared not speak aloud. In her resilience, Magdalene possessed a nobility that outshone all the glittering pretense of his court. Miles away, in her small cottage at the edge of the village, Magdalene tossed in her sleep. Her dreams were filled with images of the mysterious stranger, his piercing gaze, his quiet attention. In her dreams, he removed his hood to reveal his true identity. But each time, before she could see his face clearly, she would wake with a start, her heart pounding with inexplicable anticipation. Little did she know that as dawn approached, bringing with it another day of mockery and hardship, the most powerful man in the kingdom was preparing to return to her humble stall, drawn by a force more compelling than any matter of state. The week passed with agonizing slowness for Magdalene. Each morning she woke before dawn, paying extra care to her appearance. Not out of vanity, but from a newfound sense that perhaps she was, after all, worthy of being seen. She still wore her simple linen dress and practical apron, but she took time to brush her graying hair until it shone, and even added a small sprig of lavender from her garden, tucked discreetly behind her ear. The mysterious stranger had not returned the next day as promised, nor the day after. By the seventh day, Magdalene had begun to believe that whatever fleeting interest he had shown in her had passed. Perhaps he had moved on to another village, another kingdom entirely. The thought brought a hollow ache to her chest that surprised her with its intensity. "Did your nobleman tire of slumming among peasants?" Alderman Thomas asked with false concern as he passed her stall that morning. "Such a pity. I was beginning to wonder what special services you offered to earn such generous payment." Magdalene kept her eyes on her bread. "He was simply a traveler with appreciation for honest work," she replied, her voice betraying none of the hurt his words inflicted. "Indeed?" Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Strange how this traveler has been seen entering and leaving the King's Road, accompanied at a distance by men who bear a remarkable resemblance to royal guards." Her hands stilled momentarily before she forced herself to continue arranging her loaves. Royal guards. Could it be that the stranger was not merely wealthy, but truly of noble birth? The thought sent a flutter of panic through her. What game was being played at her expense? "Your imagination exceeds your wisdom, Alderman Thomas," she said quietly. "I sell bread, nothing more." The merchant's eyes narrowed. "We shall see." As Thomas sauntered away, satisfied with having planted seeds of disquiet, Magdalene released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The whispers had grown throughout the week, transforming from mockery of her spinsterhood to darker speculation about her relationship with the mysterious visitor. Some suggested witchcraft, others hinted at scandalous arrangements. None considered the possibility that someone might simply value her company. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent when a hush fell over the marketplace, that same peculiar silence that had heralded the stranger's previous appearances. Magdalene looked up, her heart quickening despite her attempts to temper her expectations. And there he was, taller than she remembered, his bearing somehow more commanding, though he still wore the simple traveling clothes and hood. He moved through the parting crowd with purpose, straight to her stall. "Forgive my absence," he said without preamble, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Matters of business required my attention." "There is nothing to forgive," Magdalene replied, struggling to keep her voice steady. "I am merely a baker. Your comings and goings are your own affair." A smile touched the corner of his mouth, the first she had seen from him. "Are they? I made a promise to return, did I not? Where I come from, a promise is a sacred bond." "And where is that, exactly?" she dared to ask, emboldened by the week of uncertainty. "Your home must be of some significance if Alderman Thomas speaks truly about your escort." Something flickered in the stranger's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or wariness. "The alderman is overly concerned with matters that do not affect his ledgers," he said carefully. "But yes, I come from a place where promises matter, as does honesty." He paused, studying her face. "Which is why I must ask you to join me for a meal." Magdalene blinked, certain she had misheard. "I beg your pardon." "A meal," he repeated. "Your day's work is nearly done, is it not? I would speak with you away from prying ears." She glanced around, acutely aware of the dozens of eyes watching them, the whispers already beginning to circulate. To dine with an unknown man, alone, would be scandalous for any unmarried woman, let alone one already the subject of such speculation. "I cannot," she began, but he cut her off gently. "Here then," he said, gesturing to the small space beside her stall. "In full view of the village, if that eases your concerns. I merely wish for conversation uninterrupted by commerce." Something in his earnest request broke through Magdalene's caution. What did she have to lose, after all? Her reputation. The village had already decided she was either a pitiable spinster or engaged in something unseemly. For once, she would choose her own path. "Very well," she said, surprising herself with her decisiveness. "I have bread, of course, and there is a pot of vegetable broth I brought for my own meal." The stranger nodded, seemingly pleased by her acceptance. With graceful movements that again hinted at a life far removed from peasantry, he helped her close her stall, then sat beside her on the rough wooden bench where she normally kept her accounts. What followed was the strangest meal of Magdalene's life. She served him a simple bowl of vegetable broth with a chunk of her best bread, expecting him to find it lacking after whatever fine cuisine he was accustomed to. Instead, he ate with evident appreciation, commenting on the perfect balance of herbs in the broth and the exceptional texture of the bread. "You have a rare gift," he said, breaking off another piece of the loaf. In the capital, bakers compete fiercely for royal patronage, yet none produce bread with such soul. Soul? Magdalene couldn't help but smile. "It is flour, water, and salt, sir. Nothing more mystical than that." "Is it?" His eyes met hers, surprisingly warm beneath his hood. "I have dined at tables laden with exotic spices and meats prepared by the most celebrated cooks in 7 kingdoms. Yet this simple meal brings me more satisfaction." "Why do you suppose that is?" Magdalene found herself at a loss for words. There was something in his manner, a strange combination of authority and vulnerability, that disarmed her usual caution. "Perhaps," she ventured, "it is because this food was prepared without pretense. It makes no claims to be more than it is." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Like its maker." A flush crept up Magdalene's neck. No man had spoken to her with such attention in decades. Perhaps never. The stranger listened to her words as if they contained wisdom worth hearing, his gaze never wandering to younger women passing by. For the first time in years, she felt truly seen, not as a cautionary tale or object of pity, but as a woman of value. Yet as they ate and spoke of simple things, the changing seasons, the traditions of bread-making, the small pleasures of village life, Magdalene became aware of a subtle tension growing around them. Alderman Thomas stood with a group of merchants at the edge of the square, pointing in their direction and speaking in low, urgent tones. Several of the village women who had been her most vicious tormentors had gathered to whisper and stare. "Your presence causes quite a stir," Magdalene observed, keeping her voice light despite her growing unease. "Does it trouble you?" he asked, his tone suddenly serious. She considered the question carefully. "It should," she admitted. "They will speak of this for weeks, but—" She hesitated, then continued with surprising honesty. "I find I care less than I expected. There is something liberating in providing them with genuine reason for their gossip, rather than the imagined sins they have assigned me for years." The stranger's laugh was unexpected, a rich, warm sound that drew even more attention from the onlookers. "You are remarkable," he said, the admiration in his voice unmistakable. "Most people I encounter wear masks so thick they forget their true faces beneath. Yet here you sit, authentic, despite every reason to dissemble." The intensity of his gaze made Magdalene look away. "Authenticity is a luxury afforded to those with nothing to lose," she said softly. "Or those with enough power that they need fear no consequences," he added, an odd note in his voice that she couldn't quite interpret. Before she could respond, Alderman Thomas approached, his face a study in calculated concern. "Magdalene," he said, pointedly ignoring her companion, "there are rumors circulating about your guest. As a respected elder of this village, I must express concern about your reputation." The stranger stiffened beside her, but remained silent, watching the interaction with narrowed eyes. Magdalene straightened her spine. "How kind of you to worry about my reputation after years of contributing to its ruin with your own whispers, Alderman Thomas." The merchant's face darkened. "I see your new friend has emboldened you. But consider this. Men of wealth and position often seek entertainment in villages like ours. Entertainment they would never acknowledge in their true circles." The implication hung heavy in the air. Around them, the marketplace had grown unnaturally quiet, as people strained to overhear the confrontation. To Magdalene's surprise, it was the stranger who broke the tense silence. Rising to his feet with fluid grace, He faced the alderman directly. "Your concern is noted," he said, his voice carrying a subtle authority that made Thomas take an involuntary step backward. "But misplaced. My interest in Mistress Magdalene is one of genuine respect, a concept you might find unfamiliar." A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. No one had ever dared to address the powerful merchant in such a manner. Thomas's face flushed with anger. "And who are you to speak so boldly in our village? A man who hides his face and name yet pays in royal coin. What honest business requires such secrecy?" For a moment it seemed the stranger might reveal himself. His hand moved toward his hood, then stopped. Instead, he turned to Magdalene, took her work-roughened hand in his, and bowed over it with the formal courtesy of a courtier. "Until tomorrow," he said quietly, his eyes holding a promise that made her breath catch. Then he was gone, striding through the stunned crowd with such authority that people instinctively moved aside to let him pass. Magdalene stood immobile, her hand still tingling from his touch, aware that she stood at the center of the greatest scandal the village had seen in years. Yet strangely, impossibly, she felt not shame, but a fierce, unfamiliar joy. Dark clouds gathered over Oakenfield the following afternoon, pregnant with the promise of rain. The air hung heavy with moisture, oppressive and still, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Magdalene eyed the sky with concern as she arranged her remaining loaves. The weather would turn soon, and when it did, it would turn with a vengeance. The marketplace was unusually quiet. After yesterday's confrontation with Alderman Thomas, the villagers watched Magdalene with a different kind of attention, less mockery now, more wary curiosity. The boldness of her mysterious visitor had transformed her overnight from an object of ridicule to someone potentially dangerous. If a man of obvious wealth and bearing would publicly defend her honor, what else might he do? Who else might he be? "They say he's a disgraced nobleman," whispered one woman to another as they passed her stall, not bothering to lower their voices. "Banished from court for some unspeakable crime." "I heard he's a foreign spy," countered her companion, "using poor, desperate Magdalene to gather information about our village." Magdalene pretended not to hear, but each speculation stung in its own way. None considered the possibility that the stranger might simply see something in her worth valuing. That possibility was, apparently, more fantastical than any lurid theory they could concoct. The first heavy droplets of rain began to fall just as the church bell tolled the afternoon hour. Merchants hurriedly covered their wares, and villagers scattered in search of shelter. Magdalene reached for the waxed cloth she used to protect her bread, but her movements lacked their usual efficiency. Part of her, a part she was reluctant to acknowledge, was watching for a hooded figure among the dispersing crowd. But as the gentle patter of rain transformed into a sudden downpour, there was no sign of him. Lightning split the sky, followed by a tremendous crack of thunder that seemed to shake the very earth. Within moments, the marketplace was deserted, save for Magdalene and her rapidly dampening bread. "He isn't coming," she told herself firmly, ignoring the hollow ache the words produced. "And you are a fool to expect it." As she struggled to gather her remaining loaves, the rain intensified, beating down in sheets that made it difficult to see more than a few paces ahead. Her apron was soaked through, her hair plastered to her face, when suddenly the deluge above her stopped, though she could still hear it hammering all around. "You'll catch your death," came a familiar voice. Magdalene looked up to find the stranger holding his cloak above her like a canopy, his own shoulders already darkened by rain. Despite the hood pulled low over his face, she could see concern in his eyes. "You came," she said, unable to mask her surprise. "I promised I would," he replied simply, as if keeping his word were the most natural thing in the world. "Though I appear to have chosen a rather dramatic moment for my arrival." A smile tugged at the corner of her mouth despite her best efforts to remain composed. "Indeed. The heavens themselves protest our meeting, it seems." "Then we shall defy them together," he said, helping her gather the remaining bread with his free hand, while somehow maintaining the shelter of his cloak over her. "Where can we find refuge until this passes?" Magdalene hesitated. To invite him to her cottage would be scandalous beyond redemption. Yet the alternatives, Standing in the downpour or seeking shelter in the tavern where they would be the center of unwelcome attention seemed equally impossible. Another flash of lightning made the decision for her. "My cottage," she said. "It's not far from here, at the edge of the village." They made their way through the deserted marketplace and down the muddy lane that led to Magdalen's home, sharing the inadequate shelter of his cloak. The rain was relentless, driven by a wind that seemed determined to strip the autumn leaves from their branches. By the time they reached the small stone cottage with its thatched roof, both were thoroughly soaked despite their best efforts. "It isn't much," Magdalen said as she pushed open the wooden door, suddenly self-conscious of her humble dwelling. The cottage was indeed small, a single room with a hearth at one end, a narrow bed tucked into the corner, and a rough-hewn table with 2 wooden chairs in the center. But it was immaculately clean, with bunches of dried herbs hanging from the rafters and a small vase of late-blooming wildflowers on the table. It smelled of rosemary and wood smoke. Simple, honest scents that spoke of a life lived with care despite limited means. "It's perfect," the stranger said, and something in his voice made her believe he meant it. Magdalen busied herself with practical matters, stoking the banked fire in the hearth to drive away the damp chill and hanging their wet cloaks near the growing flames. She set a kettle of water to heat and laid out the salvaged bread on a clean cloth to dry. Only when these tasks were complete did she allow herself to look directly at her visitor. Without his cloak and hood, standing in the warm glow of her hearth fire, he was even more striking than she had imagined. His clothes, though deliberately plain, were of a quality that spoke of wealth beyond village imagination. His bearing was that of a man accustomed to command, yet there was nothing arrogant in his posture as he studied her simple home with genuine interest. "You must think me terribly forward," she said at last, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. "Inviting a man whose name I don't even know into my home. Would it help if I told you my name?" he asked, turning to face her fully. Magdalen considered this. "Perhaps, though I suspect it would not be your true one." A smile crossed his face, a smile that transformed his features from merely handsome to something that made her heart skip a beat. "You are perceptive, Magdalen of Oakenfield, more so than many who claim far greater wisdom." The kettle began to sing, saving her from having to respond. She prepared 2 cups of herbal tea, a luxury she rarely allowed herself but kept for special occasions. "I have only wooden cups," she apologized, handing him one. "Nothing befitting a man who pays in royal coin." "On the contrary," he replied, accepting the cup with a slight bow. "I find myself increasingly weary of gilded chalices that disguise the bitterness of their contents." He took a sip of the fragrant tea. "This at least is exactly what it appears to be." The rain continued to beat against the thatched roof and windows, creating a strange sense of intimacy as they sat across from each other at her small table. For a while they spoke of inconsequential things: the changing seasons, the traditions of the village, the art of baking. The stranger asked questions about her life with genuine curiosity, listening to her answers as if they contained precious wisdom rather than the mundane details of a simple existence. Gradually, the awkwardness between them dissolved. Magdalen found herself speaking more freely than she had in years, sharing stories of her childhood, of caring for her mother through her long illness, of the small daily pleasures that had sustained her through years of loneliness. "You never married," he observed during a lull in the conversation. It wasn't a question, but there was no mockery in his tone, only interest. "No," she replied simply. "By the time my mother passed, I was already considered too old. And truth be told, the men of this village never held much appeal for me. Their worlds are as small as their minds. And yet, you remained here." Magdalen looked into the fire, considering her answer. "Where else would I go? This cottage, humble as it is mine. My bread is known and valued, if not always the woman who bakes it. Sometimes familiar discomfort is preferable to unknown terrors." Thunder rumbled overhead, closer now, making the cups on the table tremble slightly. In the flickering firelight, shadows danced across the stranger's face, highlighting the intensity of his gaze as he studied her. "What of you?" Magdalen asked, surprising herself with her boldness. "What brings a man who clearly belongs to a different world to our insignificant village?" And please, she added with unexpected firmness, do not insult me with tales of passing interest in country bread. For a long moment he was silent, and Magdalene feared she had overstepped. Then he set down his cup and leaned forward, his eyes never leaving hers. The truth then, he said softly. I came seeking respite from endless pretense, from a world where every word is calculated, every smile a weapon, every kindness a transaction. I found something I had forgotten existed. And what is that? Magdalene whispered, hardly daring to breathe. Lightning flashed, illuminating the small cottage in stark white light. In that brief electric moment, something changed in the stranger's expression. A decision made, a barrier crossed. You have the most beautiful soul I have ever encountered, he said, the words falling between them like stones into still water. Magdalene froze, the cup halfway to her lips. Of all the things she had imagined he might say, this was not among them. Beautiful? Her? The village spinster, with her work-roughened hands and gray-streaked hair? You mock me, she said, her voice barely audible over the rain. Never, he replied with such intensity that she could not doubt his sincerity. I have walked among those the world calls beautiful, women groomed from birth to capture a man's eye with painted faces and practiced charm. Yet in you I see something far rarer. Genuine grace that comes not from artifice, but from the strength to remain true when every force around you demands falseness. The words hung in the air between them, impossible to take back, impossible to ignore. Magdalene felt as if the ground beneath her feet had suddenly shifted, leaving her unmoored and adrift in unfamiliar waters. Before she could find her voice to respond, a commotion outside broke the spell. Female voices, high with excitement, approached the cottage. There! I told you she took him to her home, came the shrill cry of Eliza, the tanner's daughter, whose beauty was matched only by her cruelty. The old spinster has lured him inside. What shameless behavior! The stranger's face darkened with anger, but Magdalene laid a restraining hand on his arm. Let them talk, she said wearily. They always have. This just gives them fresh material. But something had shifted in the air between them, something both terrifying and exhilarating. His declaration, so unexpected, so sincere, had kindled a small flame of hope that Magdalene had thought extinguished years ago. The voices outside, the judgment, the mockery, all seemed suddenly distant and unimportant compared to the way he looked at her now, as if she were precious beyond measure. The storm passed during the night, leaving behind a world washed clean. Morning sunlight glinted off puddles that dotted the village square as Magdalene made her way to the marketplace, her basket heavy with fresh bread. Her steps were lighter than they had been in years, despite the whispers that followed her progress through the village. She kept him in her cottage all night, hissed one woman to another, not bothering to lower her voice as Magdalene passed. Shameless hussy, came the reply. At her age, no less. In truth, the stranger had left shortly after the rain subsided, reluctant but proper. He had kissed her hand at the door, a courtly gesture that sent warmth spreading through her entire body, and promised to return today. Magdalene had fallen asleep with his words echoing in her mind. You have the most beautiful soul I have ever encountered. Even now, in the harsh light of morning, those words sustained her against the village's renewed cruelty. As she set up her stall, arranging loaves still warm from her pre-dawn baking, Magdalene noticed an unusual tension in the air. The normal bustle of market day seemed subdued. Villagers gathered in small clusters, their heads bent together in urgent conversation. Occasionally, someone would glance toward the main road that led to the King's Highway, then quickly look away, as if afraid to be caught watching. What's happening? Magdalene asked old widow Hawthorne, who had approached to buy her daily loaf. The elderly woman's eyes widened with excitement. You haven't heard? Heralds arrived at dawn. The king himself is said to be visiting our village today. Royal guards have been spotted on the north road. Magdalene's hands stilled in the midst of wrapping the widow's bread. The king? Here? Whatever for? Who knows? They say he's been traveling his realm in disguise, listening to the common folk. Can you imagine? His Majesty might have walked among us, and we none the wiser." A chill ran down Magdalen's spine at these words. The king, traveling in disguise. Royal guards seen at a distance. A man who carried royal coins, yet dressed as a commoner. Surely it couldn't be. Before she could pursue this unsettling thought, a commotion at the village entrance drew everyone's attention. 6 royal guards in gleaming armor had appeared, their red and gold livery unmistakable. They formed a line on either side of the road, standing at rigid attention. "Make way for the king!" shouted the lead guard, his voice carrying across the now silent marketplace. "His Majesty, King Alaric IV approaches!" The villagers scrambled into position, dropping to their knees along the sides of the road. Magdalene remained frozen behind her stall, her heart hammering against her ribs with such force she feared it might burst. The pieces were falling into place with terrible clarity, each realization more impossible than the last. The stranger's regal bearing, his educated speech, the royal coins, the way others instinctively deferred to him despite his common dress. It couldn't be. And yet, a ripple of movement passed through the crowd as a figure on horseback appeared at the village entrance, flanked by more guards. The rider wore the full regalia of the sovereign, a crimson cloak trimmed with ermine, a golden circlet upon his brow, the royal seal of Westervale emblazoned on his chest. As he dismounted with fluid grace, the villagers bowed their heads even lower, pressing their foreheads almost to the muddy ground. All except Magdalene, who found herself unable to move or look away. For there, beneath the trappings of royalty, was the face of her stranger, the same strong jaw, the same penetrating eyes that had looked at her with such warmth just hours before. Only now, those eyes surveyed the village with the cool assessment of a monarch reviewing his realm. "Rise," commanded King Alaric, his voice carrying easily across the silent square. "I would speak with my people." As the villagers got to their feet, their expressions a mixture of awe and fear, the king's gaze swept the marketplace. For a heart-stopping moment, it passed over Magdalene without recognition, and a wave of foolish disappointment washed through her. Of course, the charade was over. Whatever game he had been playing with the village spinster had served its purpose. Now he would return to being a king, and she would remain. His eyes snapped back to her, widening almost imperceptibly. Something flickered across his face. Uncertainty, perhaps, or resolve. Then, to the astonishment of the gathered crowd, King Alaric IV began walking directly toward Magdalene's humble bread stall. Whispers erupted around them. Alderman Thomas, who had rushed forward to greet the monarch, was left gaping mid-bow as the king strode past him without acknowledgement. The village women who had mocked Magdalene most cruelly now stared in confusion as their sovereign approached the very woman they had derided for decades. Magdalene's legs felt like water beneath her. She should kneel. She should bow her head. She should show proper deference to her king. But her body refused to obey these reasonable commands. Instead, she stood motionless, her eyes locked with his as he drew nearer. 5 paces away, he stopped. The entire village held its breath. "Mistress Magdalene," he said, his voice pitched to carry to those nearby, though not quite to the edges of the crowd. "Your Majesty," she managed to reply, belatedly attempting a curtsy that her trembling legs nearly failed to complete. A murmur rippled through the onlookers. He knew her name. The king knew the village spinster by name. "I require silence," King Alaric announced, raising his hand without turning from Magdalene. The marketplace fell instantly quiet. "What I have to say is for all to hear, yet concerns this woman alone." Magdalene's heart seemed to stop beating entirely. Was this to be a public humiliation? Had she inadvertently committed some offense against the crown? Or worse, had his interest in her been nothing more than a cruel royal entertainment, a game to be concluded with her public shame? "For the past sennight," the king continued, his voice clear and measured, "I have walked among you disguised as a common traveler. I have observed your dealings, heard your words both kind and cruel, witnessed your true characters when you believed no eyes of consequence were upon you." The villagers shifted uncomfortably, exchanging uneasy glances. What had he seen? What had he heard? The implications of a king moving unrecognized among them were only now beginning to dawn on the assembled crowd. In that time, King Alaric said, his eyes never leaving Magdalen's face, I have seen cruelty disguised as jest. I have seen pettiness masquerading as propriety. I have seen a woman of exceptional dignity subjected to daily torment for the crime of choosing a life of service to her ailing mother over the security of a loveless marriage. Gasps and shocked murmurs rippled through the crowd. Eliza, the tanner's daughter, turned a sickly shade of white. Alderman Thomas seemed to shrink several inches in stature. Your Majesty, began the village headman, stepping forward with a placating gesture, if there have been misunderstandings among our people, I assure you, silence, the king commanded without raising his voice. The headman's mouth snapped shut as if physically forced closed. I speak now not as your sovereign addressing subjects, but as a man who has found something precious where others saw only opportunity for cruelty. He turned then, facing the gathered villagers fully for the first time. Let it be known that this woman, he gestured toward Magdalene, who stood paralyzed with shock, has shown more nobility in her quiet dignity than I have witnessed in a lifetime at court. While you mocked her solitude, she demonstrated a strength of character that shames the weak spirits who require others' humiliation to feel powerful. The silence that followed was absolute. Not even the birds dared to sing. In that frozen moment, Magdalene felt the weight of every eye in the village upon her, not with mockery now, but with stunned disbelief. Then King Alaric did something that would be recounted in village tales for generations to come. He turned back to Magdalene, removed the signet ring from his finger, the very symbol of his royal authority, and held it out to her. Magdalene of Oakenfield, he said, his voice softer now but no less clear, I have walked the corridors of power all my life, surrounded by those who would say anything, be anything, sacrifice anything to gain my favor. Yet in you, a woman who knew not my title nor my wealth, I found honesty so rare it shook the foundations of my cynical heart. A collective gasp rose from the crowd as understanding dawned. This was no mere royal acknowledgement. This was something far more extraordinary. Your Majesty, Magdalene whispered, finding her voice at last. I do not understand. The king's expression softened, and for a moment, the stern monarch disappeared, replaced by the man who had shared simple bread and conversation at her table. Don't you? You, who saw the man beneath the disguise when all others saw only what they expected to see? He took a step closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, the same eyes that had looked at her with such warmth by her hearth fire. The choice now is yours, he said quietly. I offer not a command, but a question, one I have never asked of any woman before you. The marketplace seemed to recede around them, the crowd fading into insignificance as Magdalene stood at the precipice of a moment that would alter the course of her life forever. The bread seller and the king, facing each other in a tableau that defied all expectations, all conventions, all reason. What would he ask of her? And more terrifying still, what would she answer? The ancient stone walls of Westervale Castle had witnessed centuries of intrigue, but none quite like the storm that now raged within its hallowed chambers. 3 days had passed since King Alaric's unprecedented declaration in the village square, and the royal court was in tumult. In the vast council chamber, with its vaulted ceilings and stained glass windows casting jewel-toned light across the marble floor, the king sat upon his throne, impassive as stone while his advisors argued before him. The golden crown upon his brow caught the afternoon sunlight, creating an almost divine aura that contrasted sharply with the very human stubbornness in his eyes. Your Majesty, I implore you to reconsider, Lord Cedric pleaded, his normally composed demeanor fraying at the edges. The Princess of Moravia's father has already dispatched her dowry train. To reject the alliance now would be tantamount to declaring hostility toward our strongest northern ally. The diplomatic implications are dire indeed, added the Chancellor, a thin, dour man whose entire life had been devoted to navigating the treacherous waters of international relations. Moravia controls the mountain passes we rely upon for trade. If they were to close those routes in retaliation, enough. The king's voice cut through the chamber like a blade. I have not rejected the alliance. I have merely postponed discussion of it until more pressing matters are resolved. More pressing than the security of the realm? Challenged Duke Haverford, the most outspoken of the council members. What matter could possibly take precedence over a strategic marriage that has been negotiated for 3 years? King Alaric's eyes narrowed dangerously. Choose your next words with care, Haverford. You speak to your sovereign. The Duke bristled, but lowered his gaze in grudging deference. Forgiveness, Your Majesty. We are all concerned for the kingdom's welfare. This unexpected development has taken us by surprise. This unexpected development, as you so delicately phrase it, the king replied with deceptive mildness, is a matter of my personal choice, something I have seldom been permitted in my 17 years wearing this crown. A tense silence fell over the chamber. The courtiers exchanged uneasy glances, none daring to voice what all were thinking, that their king had lost his senses over a common village woman. From the shadowed alcove where she had been instructed to wait, Magdalene watched the proceedings with growing dismay. The magnificent gown of deep blue silk that had been hastily commissioned for her felt like a costume. The elaborate hairstyle created by the royal handmaidens, a pretense that fooled no one. She did not belong here, among these people of power and privilege who regarded her with barely concealed contempt. The journey from Oakenfield to the royal castle had passed in a blur. After the king's shocking public declaration, a declaration that had fallen short of a formal proposal but had implied far more than mere royal favor, Magdalene had been swept into a whirlwind of unprecedented events. Royal guards had escorted her to the castle, servants had ushered her into chambers more spacious than the entire cottage where she had spent her life, and an army of attendants had descended upon her to transform the village baker into someone deemed presentable at court. Now, watching the king defend his interest in her against the united opposition of his advisors, Magdalene felt a creeping sense of dread. This was madness, a fleeting royal fancy that would pass, leaving her neither a village baker nor a royal consort, but something far worse, a discarded curiosity, a cautionary tale. "The woman is 40 years old," came a new voice, cutting through her troubled thoughts. The royal physician, an elderly man with cold, assessing eyes, had joined the debate. "Well past her childbearing prime. If your majesty seeks a companion, there are more appropriate arrangements that would not compromise the succession." Magdalene flinched as if struck, though she had known this argument would inevitably arise. Hearing it stated so baldly, her age, her presumed barrenness, was a humiliation that pierced deeper than any village mockery. To her surprise, it was a woman who spoke next, Lady Beatrice, the king's widowed aunt and the only female member of the royal council. "You speak of her as if she were a broodmare, physician," Lady Beatrice said, her aristocratic voice dripping with disdain. "His Majesty is not without heirs. His brother's sons stand in succession. The question is not one of fertility, but of suitability." Her cold gaze swept toward the alcove where Magdalene stood partially hidden. A commoner, with no education, no training in statecraft, no understanding of the complexities of royal duties. What possible value could such a woman bring to the throne beyond momentary distraction? A muscle twitched in the king's jaw, the only sign that the barrage of criticism had penetrated his regal composure. When he spoke again, his voice was dangerously quiet. "I have listened to your concerns, all of you. Now you will listen to mine." He rose from the throne, commanding the complete attention of the room through presence alone. "For 17 years I have ruled according to your counsel. I have made political marriages and alliances. I have sacrificed personal happiness for state necessity. I have been by all accounts a dutiful king." He descended the 3 steps from the dais, moving to the center of the chamber where he stood surrounded by his advisors yet somehow apart from them, isolated by the weight of the crown he bore. "In that time, what has become of me as a man? I move through a world of fabrications so elaborate we mistake them for reality. Every word spoken in my presence is curated to manipulate. Every smile hides calculation. Every gesture of loyalty masks ambition. The chamber had grown so quiet that Magdalene could hear the distant call of birds beyond the stained glass windows. The king continued, his voice gaining strength not through volume but through conviction. Then I encountered a woman who had no reason to falsify herself for my benefit, who did not even know my station, yet showed me greater truth in one conversation than I have witnessed in a decade of court intrigue. A collective intake of breath followed this declaration. Never had King Alaric spoken so openly of his disillusionment with court life, with the very people who now stood before him. "Your Majesty," ventured the Archbishop, who had thus far remained silent, "while your sentiments are understandable, there are practical concerns that cannot be dismissed. The common people expect their sovereign to maintain certain standards. A queen from the lowest ranks of society would undermine the very foundation of the social order we strive to preserve." Would it? The king's gaze swept the assembled courtiers. Or would it remind everyone that true nobility is not conferred by birth alone, but proven through character? I have met dukes with less dignity than this baker, chancellors with less wisdom, princesses with far less grace. Magdalene felt heat rise to her cheeks at his words. She had never sought such elevation, had never imagined herself worthy of royal notice, let alone royal praise. The attention directed toward her alcove increased as several courtiers turned to study her with renewed interest. "I prefer the soul of an honest commoner to the hollow beauty of courtiers," the king declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast chamber. The silence that followed was absolute. No one dared contradict the direct statement of the sovereign, yet the shock that rippled through the assembly was palpable. Several of the younger court ladies exchanged glances of horror and indignation. The Moravian ambassador, who had been observing from the periphery, turned an alarming shade of purple. It was Lord Cedric who finally broke the impasse, stepping forward with the caution of a man approaching a wounded predator. "Your Majesty, no one questions your appreciation of the lady's character, but perhaps a compromise might be reached. A position of honor at court, special status as a royal companion, without the formalities of—" "You suggest I make her my mistress?" the king cut in flatly. "A position of honor, yet without honor? No. Then at least allow time for preparation," Cedric pleaded. "If you are determined on this course, let us arrange for proper training in court etiquette, diplomatic protocols, the histories of noble houses. The lady would benefit from such education before being thrust into the full scrutiny of the realm." For the first time, the king appeared to consider a suggestion with genuine thought rather than outright rejection. He glanced toward Magdalene's alcove, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "That is not unreasonable," he conceded, "though the decision ultimately rests with the lady herself." All eyes turned toward Magdalene, who wished desperately for the stone floor to open and swallow her whole. She had been silent throughout the proceedings, aware that any word she uttered would be dissected, analyzed, and inevitably found wanting by these people trained from birth in the art of courtly discourse. But now, with the king's acknowledgement, she could remain hidden no longer. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward into the full light of the council chamber. The rustle of her silk gown seemed unnaturally loud in the silence, the weight of dozens of critical gazes almost a physical pressure upon her skin. "Your Majesty," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice, "I am grateful beyond words for the honor you have shown me, but I fear Lord Cedric speaks wisely. I am unprepared for the role you envision." "Perhaps," she faltered briefly, then continued with renewed resolve, "perhaps it would be best if I returned to my village while you reconsider this matter with the clear sight that distance provides." A murmur of approval rippled through the council members, quickly silenced by the king's raised hand. His eyes remained fixed on Magdalene, searching her face with an intensity that made her heart race, despite her determination to remain composed. "Is that truly your wish?" he asked quietly. "To return to those who mocked and scorned you? Or do you merely fear you are unequal to the challenges before you?" Before Magdalene could respond, the chamber doors burst open with a bang that echoed like thunder through the vaulted space. A messenger rushed in, dropping to one knee before the throne, his breath coming in gasps. "Your Majesty," he panted, "forgive the interruption. Word has spread throughout the capital. Crowds gather at the castle gates, demanding to see the commoner who has captured the king's heart. The people have already begun calling her the Baker Queen. The great plaza outside the royal palace teemed with humanity. Thousands of common folk had gathered, their faces turned expectantly toward the palace balcony, where royal proclamations were traditionally delivered. The murmur of countless voices created a sound like the ocean, rising and falling in waves of anticipation. Children sat upon their fathers' shoulders for a better view, while merchants had abandoned their stalls to witness the unprecedented spectacle. "Is it true?" asked a washerwoman of her neighbor. "Has the king truly chosen a baker for his queen?" "My cousin's husband works in the castle kitchens," came the eager reply. "He says she's 40 years old with gray in her hair, yet the king looks at her as if she were the fairest maiden in the realm. They say she stood up to the entire royal council," added another, his eyes wide with admiration. "Told them she was returning to her village rather than be a pawn in court politics." The stories had spread through the capital like wildfire, growing more elaborate with each telling. Some claimed Magdalene was a witch who had enchanted the king. Others insisted she was a lost princess raised among commoners, her true identity finally discovered. The more prosaic truth, that she was simply a woman who had endured decades of ridicule with quiet dignity, seemed too ordinary for such extraordinary events. Within the palace, separated from the crowd by stone walls and generations of privilege, Magdalene stood in a small antechamber adjacent to the royal balcony. Her hands, once rough from years of kneading dough, had been smoothed with almond oils by royal attendants, though no treatment could erase the evidence of a lifetime of labor. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk that whispered against the marble floor with each anxious step she took. A simple circlet of polished silver held back her hair, a compromise after she had refused the elaborate jeweled tiara the royal dresser had presented. "They are waiting," said King Alaric, entering the chamber with the silent grace that still startled her. Even in the weeks since the remarkable events in her village, she had not grown accustomed to his sudden appearances, nor to the intensity of his gaze when it fell upon her. "For what?" Magdalene asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "For you to come to your senses, for me to vanish back into obscurity, for a fairy tale ending that cannot possibly exist?" The king crossed the chamber to stand before her, close enough that she could detect the faint scent of cedarwood that clung to his royal garments. Without the crown upon his brow, he had left it in the council chamber. He looked almost like the traveler who had first approached her stall, though the authority in his bearing could never truly be disguised. "They wait," he said quietly, "for us to decide our own ending. Not the council, not tradition, not expectation. Us." Magdalene turned away, moving to the narrow window that overlooked the castle gardens. Below, roses still bloomed in defiance of the approaching winter, their petals catching the late autumn sunlight. How simple their existence seemed compared to the impossible choice that now lay before her. "A week ago, I knew exactly who I was," she said, watching a fallen petal drift to the garden path. "Magdalene of Oakenfield, baker, spinster, object of village mockery. The boundaries of my life were clear, if not always kind. Now," she trailed off, gesturing helplessly at her silk gown, the royal chamber, the crowds beyond the palace walls. "Now you stand at a crossroads," the king finished for her. "As do I." He joined her at the window, his reflection appearing beside hers in the leaded glass. For a moment, they simply stood in silence, two figures from worlds that should never have intersected, yet somehow had. "The council has made their position clear," Magdalene said at last. "I am too old, too common, too unschooled in the ways of court to be a suitable queen. Perhaps they are right. The council sees only what they expect to see," Alaric replied, a hint of frustration edging his voice. "Just as the villagers saw only an aging spinster, not the woman of remarkable strength who stood before them. Just as I saw only subjects to be ruled, not people with lives as complex and valuable as my own, until I set aside my crown and walked among them." He turned to face her directly, and Magdalene found herself unable to look away from the earnestness in his eyes. "You asked me once why I came to your village. The truth is, I had grown hollow inside these castle walls. Every face I saw was a mask, every word a calculation. I went seeking, I hardly know what, Reality, perhaps. Something genuine in a world of fabrication. And you found it in a loaf of bread, Magdalene said, unable to keep a hint of wry humor from her voice despite the gravity of the moment. The king's lips curved into the smile that still made her heart quicken. I found it in the hands that crafted that bread. In the dignity that withstood years of cruelty without becoming cruel in return. In eyes that saw the man, not the crown. From beyond the palace walls came the distant roar of the crowd, their patience wearing thin as they awaited the appearance of their sovereign and the common woman who had somehow captured his attention. "They will never accept me," Magdalene said softly. "Look again," Alaric suggested, gesturing toward the window that faced the great plaza. Reluctantly, Magdalene moved to the larger window and gazed down at the sea of humanity below. What she saw made her breath catch. Among the countless upturned faces were ordinary folk, bakers, blacksmiths, tanners, farmers, seamstresses, people like her who had never imagined one of their own might ascend to such heights. And in their expressions, she saw not rejection, but a wild, impossible hope. "They see themselves in you," the king said, coming to stand beside her. "A woman who baked bread with her own hands, who endured life's hardships with grace, who speaks truth even to a king. If you can rise from the village square to the royal palace, what might be possible for them? For their daughters? Their sons?" Magdalene pressed her palm against the cool glass, overwhelmed by the weight of expectation visible in the crowd below. "And if I fail them? If I prove unequal to this role you envision? Then we will have failed together," Alaric replied simply. "But I do not believe you will fail. The woman who stood firm against decades of mockery possesses more strength than those born to privilege can imagine." A knock at the chamber door interrupted them. Lord Cedric entered, his face a careful mask of neutrality. "Your Majesty, the people grow restless. They demand to see the lady." His eyes flickered briefly to Magdalene, then back to the king. "A decision must be made. Now." King Alaric nodded once. "Indeed it must, but not by me alone." He turned to Magdalene, and to her shock, took her work-roughened hand in his. "The choice is yours. Return to your village with my eternal gratitude and a pension to ensure your comfort for the rest of your days. Or, Magdalene whispered, though she knew what alternative he offered. Or step onto that balcony beside me, not as a subject, but as my equal. Not because tradition demands it, but because the man beneath the crown, chooses you above all others." Lord Cedric made a sound that might have been a suppressed groan. "Your Majesty, I must insist that we consider the diplomatic implications. Leave us," the king commanded without taking his eyes from Magdalene's face. The advisor hesitated, then bowed stiffly and withdrew. Alone again, Magdalene closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the choice before her. To return to Oakenfield would mean safety, familiarity, a comfortable obscurity. To stay would mean scrutiny, challenges, a life for which nothing had prepared her. Yet when she opened her eyes and met the king's gaze, she found herself remembering not the regal figure who commanded armies and signed treaties, but the man who had sat at her humble table sharing bread and conversation. The man whose eyes had lit with genuine interest when she spoke. The man who had defended her dignity when no one else would. "If I agree," she said slowly, "it must be on one condition." The king raised an eyebrow, waiting. "I must remain myself," Magdalene continued, finding strength in the clarity of her conviction. "Not a pale imitation of courtly ladies, not a puppet mouthing words others have placed in my lips, but the woman you first saw in the marketplace, plain-spoken, hard-working, true to her own nature." For a long moment, Alaric was silent, his expression unreadable. Then, to Magdalene's astonishment, he laughed, a genuine sound of delight that she had heard only once before, in her cottage during the rainstorm. "My dear Magdalene," he said, his voice warm with affection, "that is precisely why I stand before you now. The last thing this court needs is another mask. What it needs, what I need, is exactly what you are." Together, they moved toward the balcony doors. As royal guards pulled them open, sunlight streamed in, momentarily blinding in its brightness. The roar of the crowd washed over them like a physical force. Standing at the threshold between her old life and an unimaginable new one, Magdalene felt a curious calm settle over her. She had spent 40 years being defined by what she lacked: a husband, children, beauty, by the narrow standards of her village. Now, standing beside a king who looked at her as if she were the greatest treasure in his realm, she understood a truth that had eluded her throughout those years of mockery and solitude. Her value had never depended on others' recognition of it. The dignity she had maintained through decades of cruelty had been its own reward, shaping her into a woman capable of standing tall when opportunity finally knocked at her door. "Are you ready?" asked the king, offering his arm. Magdalene took a deep breath, then placed her hand upon his sleeve. "Yes," she said simply. "I am ready." As they stepped out onto the balcony together, the afternoon sun caught the silver circlet in her hair, creating a momentary illusion of a crown. The crowd below erupted in a thunderous roar of approval, not for the regal figure they had always known, but for the ordinary woman who had proven that the most beautiful soul could be found in the most unexpected place. And in that moment, a new chapter began. Not just for Magdalene and her king, but for a kingdom that would never again judge worth by appearance alone. As Magdalene's remarkable journey shows us, true value isn't measured by youth, beauty, or the approval of others. It's found in the quiet dignity with which we face life's cruelties, in the authenticity we maintain when the world demands we wear masks. Would you have had her courage to remain true to herself through decades of mockery? Would you have recognized the worth of your soul when everyone around you denied it? Sometimes, the most powerful act of rebellion is simply believing in your own worth when the world tells you that you have none. Magdalene didn't need a king to make her valuable. She was already a queen in spirit long before a crown was offered. Her story reminds us that it's never too late for life to surprise us, never too late for love to find us, never too late to step into the sunlight and be truly seen. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more tales that remind us of the extraordinary potential hiding within ordinary lives. Like Magdalene, your soul has value beyond measure, and sometimes the most beautiful chapters of our lives begin precisely when we think our story is already written.